Even as a young child, I have been drawn to all things dark and evil. While other children were busy making friends, climbing trees, and joining Little League, I was busy delving into my morbid fascination with horror. Some of my most clear memories of this time was being constantly in possession of one of R.L. Stine's Goosebumps novels. I'm sure that my teachers were a little concerned that I literally did every book report in elementary school on this horror fiction series. As I got a little older, I discovered a similar but even darker series of novels by the same author titled Fear Street. When I found out that Netflix was releasing a 3-part movie series loosely based on the Fear Street novels, I was cautiously excited, as I didn't want another childhood memory ruined by a big production company who was out of touch with the content as well as the audience. This Fear Street trilogy isn't based on any single or even all of the novels, but instead keeps the setting and background premise but with their own narrative while simultaneously trying to keep the same spirit of the entire series of novels. This is a giant undertaking, and a lot to juggle at once. But it does start off pretty good, starting with the familiar town of Shadyside, which is rivaled by the newly added town of Sunnyvale. Very similar to the novels, Shadyside seems cursed, with regular bizarre tragedies, while Sunnyvale is mostly safe from such misfortunes. Also closely related with the novels is the history of Shadyside and witchcraft, which provides a strong familiar background which I think fans of the books will appreciate. The Fear Street series being aimed at an older and more mature audience, the trilogy also isn't shy in its use of violence and the occasional sex scene, which anyone who is only used to R.L. Stine's younger children's books might find aggressive or distasteful. And although I love Goosebumps, this isn't that. This is Fear Street. Part 1 begins in 1994, and revolves around high schooler Dina and her younger brother Josh, who live in Shadyside, which has just suffered another in a long line of mass murder tragedies. Dina's girlfriend Sam just moved to the affluent and safe neighboring town of Sunnyvale, which ends their relationship. And at a football memorial service headed by Sheriff Good, honoring those killed in the most recent Shadyside attack, the two rival schools begin to fight one another, which leads to an accident where Sam is injured and her blood drips into the long-cursed land in which she sees a vision of an ancient witch that most people believe is only a legend. In the coming days, however, it becomes clear that something very sinister has been awakened in Shadyside, which leads Dina, Josh, and their friends to someone who has survived the centuries-old curse, who they try to reach while trying to survive the bloody revenge of this old and evil witch. Part 1 definitely has the vibe of a young adult novel, with an absurd absence of parents, teachers, or authority figures in any real capacity. The central characters of Part 1 are Dina, Josh, Sam, and their drug-dealing besties, Kate and Simon. Most of the film follows these 5, which actually works pretty well as the characters are fairly well written and acted. Occasionally, the relationship angle between Dina and Sam grows tiresome and boring, but thankfully Josh, Kate, and Simon were there to bring the film back from the dead whenever that happened. It almost had a Stranger Things feel to it, as similar to that. We watch the same group continue to fight and struggle together, and we begin to root for them to survive and succeed. In my opinion, this is one of the biggest strengths of Part 1. One aspect that was neither a strength nor a weakness was the violence and killers. Part 1, though taking place in 1994, obviously wasn't using technology from that time. The violence in Part 1 isn't bad, but it also isn't necessarily good either. I am not against using CGI, and in fact I think coupled with practical effects it can be very useful. But in this instance I think this might be CGI overkill. While it didn't look bad, it did look pretty fake, but still cool. The villains in Part 1 were also not bad, but not great either. The costumes and makeup were really good, but they just seemed kind of bland, without a lot of explanation and minimal background as to who they were before this ancient curse turned them into brain-dead monsters hell-bent on continuing their mass murder spree. One obvious thing that stood out to me in Fear Street Part 1, 1994, is that they really wanted us to know that this was taking place in 1994. The way they did this was by playing nearly every hit of the 1990s, regardless of whether it was even released in 1994. Aside from the liberal use of release years, this is also an extremely obnoxious and lazy way to try and place the time and era of Part 1. Music can be very effective in this way, but I think it should be handled with much more subtlety, and not in such an abrasive manner as it is here. Ultimately though, Fear Street Part 1 is a solid introduction to the trilogy, and leads us into Fear Street Part 2, 1978. Fear Street Part 2 picks up immediately where Part 1 leaves off, with Dina and Josh locating Cindy Berman, the one who survived the witch attacks of 1978. Now grown, Cindy lives alone and has been visibly scarred by the horrific events that took place some 30 years ago. At first reluctant to help the young kids as she is eager to keep the past buried, she finally relents and begins to tell her tale of that fateful summer way back in 1978. From this point forward, Part 2 takes place exclusively in 1978 at Camp Nightwing, where Cindy, her sister Ziggy, and several other counselors, including the young future Sheriff Good, are attending with a bunch of kids from both Shadyside and Sunnyvale. Cindy has tried her hardest to lose the stigma attached with being a Shadysider, which her sister Ziggy believes is foolish as everyone from the town is cursed. Ziggy's somewhat resentful attitude often makes her the target of her Sunnyvale peers, to which Cindy more than not turns a blind eye. One day, her perfect boyfriend Tommy is accosted by Nurse Lane, whose daughter Ruby was the latest mass murderer in Shadyside, and she forebodingly tells him that he is next in a long line of tragedies to come. This rattles Tommy, but Cindy casually dismisses the nurse's actions as medical or drug-induced hallucinations. But things suddenly change when they, along with fellow perpetually stoned counselors Alice and Arnie, discover a map that leads them to an underground cavern, where Tommy seemingly begins to lose his sanity, which causes Cindy and Alice to become trapped, and the rest of the counselors and campers are unknowingly put in a deadly situation which the town will soon not forget. Part 2 begins in much the same manner as Part 1, with an overly obvious era-defining soundtrack, as well as the introduction of highly cliched characters. But while Part 2 does have an undertone of supernatural elements that was plainly present in Part 1, 1978 has the spirit of a classic slasher. All of the ingredients are there: a summer camp, the woods, attractive and vulnerable counselors, and of course, a maniac wielding a sharp axe. Fear Street 1978 definitely feels inspired by films like The Last House on the Left, Friday the 13th, Sleepaway Camp, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, among countless others. This makes me feel at home, as slashers are my absolute favorite in the horror genre, and Part 2 does a respectable job in paying homage to this often maligned but highly entertaining genre. One thing that is slightly different than the classic slashers that built a reputation that is both glorified and haunted slashers is that no one is safe at Camp Nightwing, counselors or children. Everyone is at risk of being hacked to death, and although the much more violent and savage kills are safe for the promiscuous and joint-smoking counselors, the campers also find themselves on the wrong end of the maniac's sharp steel. Whether or not this is in bad taste, remember that it's just a movie, and I see it as nothing more than adding unexpected shock value, which I always appreciate. Also similar to Part 1, 1978 uses CGI, but the kills and gore were still pretty sick, and that is something that I think that any gore fan would enjoy very much. Part 2, as in Part 1, has some pretty likable central and side characters. Both Cindy and Ziggy stood out, but even side characters, Alice, the young Sheriff Good, and the boyfriend-turned-maniacal killer Tommy also did very well. The solid acting brings these characters to life, and really makes the viewer care about them and root for them to survive, but as is often the case in horror films, and with tragic outcomes. Fear Street Part 2 I think is superior to Part 1, but Part 2 not only kept my undivided attention, but also got me excited for what was to come in Fear Street Part 3. Fear Street Part 3, 1666, sees Dina traveling back to the founding town of Union, before it split into Shadyside and Sunnyvale, as she relives the events of the curse through the eyes of Sarah Fear. Most, if not all, of the actors from the previous two parts return, although as completely different characters, which brings with it a certain familiarity and interest to see how similar or different they would be from the characters they played in their former roles. Taking place in the 17th century, things such as curses, demonic possessions, and witchcraft were thought of as not only real, but common, and the consequences of a conviction was immediate death. Dina finds herself living out the life of Sarah Fear, who is strong-willed, and doesn't conform to the puritanical rules set by the community. Sarah has a special kind of relationship with Hannah, who is the pastor's daughter. One night, when all of the town's young people sneak out for a wild night, the two take things to the next level, which is seen as a grave and unforgivable sin. Soon after, things in Union begin to take a disastrous turn, which the townfolk strongly believe is the work of a witch. Rumors of Sarah and Hannah's illicit relationship begin to swirl, and it isn't long before the two find themselves accused of practicing witchcraft. Full of rage and with vengeance on her mind, Sarah decides to turn to the dark arts, only to discover that someone in their tight-knit community has already summoned evil forces for their own personal gain, and Sarah finds herself the scapegoat and ends up sacrificing her life for Hannah's. We are then teleported back to the present, or as it is called Fear Street 1994, Part 2. Armed with the truth, Dina and Josh, along with Ziggy and local street painter Martin, must come up with a plan to finally rid Shadyside of the curse that has shrouded their town for the past 400 years, obviously taking place hundreds of years prior to the first two parts. Fear Street Part 3, 1666 has striking overtones of the Salem witch trials which occurred in colonial North America in the late 1600s. Part 3 can also be taken as a modern version of the Arthur Miller play The Crucible, which also dramatizes these events. Like most accounts of these witch trials, evidence was scarce, mostly relying on hearsay and bogus eyewitness statements. In this regard, Part 3 seems to follow a pretty basic and well laid out path that has been done before, and while it is nothing really new, it does give it the fair amount of respect it deserves, and keeps the audience intrigued to follow the story to its conclusion. The final act of this Fear Street trilogy returns us to 1994, and while this finale is fairly clean and leaves little loose ends, it was somewhat lackluster to what it could have been. Besides a pretty epic final speech that Dina gives before the final assault on this ancient curse, the last fight between good and evil just didn't inspire me as much as it should. This is mostly due to the fact that all of the very likable characters were already killed off at some point prior, leaving really only Josh as the one to root for. The remaining characters were either not likable, uninteresting, or underdeveloped, and instead of this last stand being truly something special, it just kind of rather fell flat. But even though I'd much rather have some other characters appear in this final battle, it is still wrapped up nicely, not leaving the viewer with too many questions, which in a trilogy could easily be the case. The Fear Street trilogy was a big and bold project for Netflix and director Lee Janiak, and it could have easily collapsed and failed. However, it manages to keep the spirit of the classic R.L. Stine series while maintaining its own style, which is no easy task. While the CGI gore effects are to a degree a bit much, this trilogy holds up as an entertaining, if flawed, production. And who knows, perhaps this will encourage a new generation to seek out the classic book series that was a big part of my life for so many years. And guys, that's going to be it for this review. I hope you liked it, and I hope you will join me next time right here on Hides Horror. Thanks for watching, guys.
Can you please help us?
Cindy?
Sadie!
What are you doing down there?
It's kind of a long story. Are you okay?
Yeah, just hold on a second.
What is going on?
My sister's in the toilet.